Good evening. Thanks, everyone for coming. I'm Jamie Fitch, the Sustainability Manager for the town of Scarborough. We're here this evening, as a follow-up to, a meeting that we had about a year ago, talking about the vulnerability assessment. The town has been working on this process for about a year and a half now. And so we have, no, you're fine. We have, GEI here, to kind of walk us through the results of the vulnerability assessment. We're really going to focus on what the results are for Pine Point. And then as part of the assessment, we did, the group did, or GEI consultants did 3 pilot projects, and the one focused at Pine Point was basically a adaptation guide for homeowners. So things that you might be able to do around your at your property to make it more resilient to flooding, because you saw in 2024 flooding is very possible, very likely down here, and I know you've experienced it beyond or even outside of 2024, and it looks like flooding is going to become a more regular occurrence in our coastal communities. So I am going to turn things over. Oh, I do want to just put out a brief caveat first, and explain the vulnerability assessment is a planning project. This really was intended to give the town an idea of where our vulnerabilities are, what infrastructure, what areas are vulnerable, so that we can have a plan to move forward to begin addressing them. As we'll hear tonight, there's a lot of areas in Scarborough that are currently prone to flooding and will become prone to flooding in the future. And so all of the recommendations that are in the vulnerability assessment will require another level of planning to implement them. But this is really a snapshot of the things that the town needs to begin thinking about and planning for in the future. So we have Leela Pike from GEI Consultants, who led the vulnerability assessment for GEI. She's going to walk us through the process that they followed and the town followed, the results of the study and recommendations. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. We do ask that you hold questions until the end so we can get through all of the information before we get to questions.
Thank you. I'm competing with the air conditioner, so if you can't hear me, just give a little wave and it'll remind you to speak up. But I will try my best to talk loudly. So thank you. This is my second time here as part of this project. I came almost a year ago as an introduction to the project. We did a table exercise around possible flood scenarios where we got some feedback from you all on adaptation ideas for your community. We have at this point almost completed this project, so tonight we're going to go over some of the findings and how you can find more information yourself. So we'll give an introduction, flood exposure to the neighborhood, and walk you through the story map. So that's an online resource for you to explore the results from this project. I'll talk about adaptation recommendations for your neighborhood, and we'll walk through that homeowner adaptation guide. As Jamie mentioned, this is a screening level coastal flood risk study, so it's a very high level planning effort. The whole purpose of this is really the first step in I shouldn't even say first step because the town has done many steps already, but this is one of those initial steps towards identifying infrastructure that is at risk for coastal flooding and prioritizing which infrastructure or areas to focus on for adaptation. So it's a high level study. As part of this, we did do some pilot projects. Pine Point Homeowner Adaptation Guide is one of them. And we also reviewed some of the town ordinances, which we'll talk about a little bit farther on. This project started in spring of 2024, although it had been in the works since the fall before then. So long before those January 2024 storm events. This was not in response to that, a coincidental occurrence. And so the timing was really quite right for really starting on this process. We're here at the end, fall 2025. So we had a meeting last week at Higgins Beach. We have this meeting tonight. And we had a town council meeting a couple of weeks ago. And from here, there's a couple of products that we're finalizing as well as that story map. Here's a reminder of what that flooding looked like in January of 2024. So Pine Point Road was inundated, as you can see, so nobody could get in and out of the neighborhood. I'm sure you remember when this happened. The major question here around flood exposure is which areas of what infrastructure are at risk of coastal flooding now? And then in the future. So what do we need to prioritize right now and what do we need to start planning for? Coastal flooding is flooding that is due to storm surge and sea level rise. We did not include flooding from rain events. So that's important to know that this is really from the tide for today and in the future. I'm not diving deep into how we came up with these flood scenarios. We did talk about this in previous presentations, and it is outlined in the story map and some work products, so you can go into that on your own. But for now, what I will say is that we looked at 10 different flood scenarios. Each of these represented a different water level so that the ocean could be, and each of those water levels represents a scenario or multiple scenarios. So, for example, scenario 4 is a water level of 9.6 feet high in elevation. That is a situation that could happen today due to a coastal storm event, or it could happen during regular everyday high tide by the year 2100. So however we get to that water level, it could be a smaller storm, a larger storm, some amount of sea level rise or no sea level rise. The water could get to that same elevation in a different combination, and we whittled down these elevations into 10 different scenarios. There's a few that we're going to focus on tonight. One is that scenario 4, which is really similar to that January 2024 event. Scenario 3 and 5 are scenarios that represent both a king tide or highest astronomical tide in the year 2050, as well as that 100-year or 1% annual chance coastal storm event in 2050. So that would be a similar event to that January storm, but with 1.5 feet of sea level rise. And then scenario 6 and 8 are when we look farther into the year 2100. So once there's 4 feet of sea level rise, what would that king tide flooding look like versus that 100-year storm flooding? And as I mentioned, what isn't included is rain events. What also is not included in these water levels are waves. So as waves come into the shore, the water levels get higher. For Pine Point, there is a significant area that's subject to wave action flooding. So we have highlighted that in the maps, and that did come into play to account when we prioritized our road infrastructure. So you will see that, but it's not reflective of these just straight water surface elevations. So the story map, I'm going to open up the website. This website you can access from the Town of Scarborough website. If you look up the flood vulnerability assessment, there will be a link to the story map. That's what this website is. This website really compiles all of the information from this project. So as you scroll through, you can read about the methodology, the background. There are links to the reports that we created, relevant photos from past flooding, talk about sea level rise. But where I'm going to go now is the flood exposure results section. And in this section, we get to this interactive map where it says, click anywhere to interact. That's what I will do. And what we can do here is turn on these different flood scenarios to see what that looks like. So I'll turn on flood scenario 4. This is that flooding, January 2024 flooding. It doesn't show the wave action in this photo. So you can see for Pine Point, we're getting a lot of flooding that's coming from the backside, the marsh side. And that is flooding without any wave action. So you add in waves from the ocean side, and you'll get even more flooding there. But without waves, just the level of the water, you will start to get that flooding on the marsh side. I'm sure that you all experience that, especially over by the Avenue, Jones Creek Drive. As we get into future scenarios, so you can turn on and off scenarios, you can see how flooding gets much worse. So this is scenario 8. This would be a 100-year storm with 4 feet of sea level rise. So that starts to look pretty significant flooding in this neighborhood.
Excuse me, would it help to dim the lights here? See that screen?
Yes,
Fine.
I think it makes a big difference.
yeah.
Yes.
Let's.
Better.
Yeah, much better.
Thank you for that.
Oh, I can see what's going on now. Okay, so I'm just gonna walk through some of those scenarios again. So here we are, I'm not in the story map now. The story map is there for you to explore, but we're just back on our PowerPoint presentation. So here's that January event. And now adding on wave action. So this is an area where you'd likely see wave action, a lot of the dune, and then some of those coastal houses along the dune. There was quite a significant amount of erosion that occurred of the dune system from that storm. About 20 to 30 feet of dune loss did occur. And then there's also potential for some splashover flooding. So between these two areas where there's standing water flooding to the backside, wave action from the front, there is some there's situations there where you could get additional splashover flooding from those waves. So for storm events, wave damage and erosion potential is pretty high for those dunes. That's what we have experienced from these storms. There would also be limited access to this neighborhood. So both Pine Point Road so Pine Point Road was definitely inaccessible. East Grand Ave, probably in Old Orchard Beach was inaccessible, which cuts off this neighborhood as a whole. And then, as I mentioned, there's that standing water flooding and wave action flooding. So if we move forward to the year 2050 and we look at a king tide or highest astronomical tide event, this is where you would see flooding outside of a storm event. So this may occur once a year, twice a year, just from those astronomically high tides. So we're not likely to see wave action flooding in this scenario on the beach side. This is really where that low-lying marsh side section near the avenues, Jones Creek Drive, would really start to see some of that flooding just from astronomically high tides. Damage from waves is not likely in this scenario. Again, it's just that standing water flooding, but also Pine Point Road is expected to flood in this situation. So again, that access to the neighborhood could be limited. And then this slide shows the year 2050 with a storm event. So more flooding, and then you add in the wave action and the splashover potential. But still the most significant impact to buildings is still that area on the marsh side. When we look to 2100, this would be the astronomical high tides, that king tide event. Again, that backside marsh section would start to see that once or twice a year flooding of the neighborhood, as well as Pine Point Road. And then when you look at a storm event in 2100 with 4 feet of sea level rise,
We're going.
there's a pretty significant area of the neighborhood that would likely experience flooding. Those I know are daunting to look at. You can explore those results in the story map. We also created some technical memos that detail our work. There are links to those in the story map as well. If you prefer to read the technical documentation, it's there for you. Maybe if you need help falling asleep. So as part of the study, it is a high level planning study. But a lot of the infrastructure that we're seeing that's at risk to flooding are roadways. There were quite a few roads in the town that were identified as having risk to flooding. So over 100, I think 111 roads were identified in this study. 38 of those roads were at risk during present day water levels and 62 of those roads by 2050. So it's quite a high number of roads. And we wanted to work with the town on how they could really hone in on which roads to focus on for prioritization. Some roads are more important than others, will have a larger impact. You know, Pine Point Road, when it's overtopped, the whole neighborhood gets cut off. There might be some other roads where if they're impacted, maybe it's just one house, or maybe it's the end of the dead end street, and so it doesn't have as much of an impact. So we looked at 5 different consequences for if roads were to be inundated. We looked at the area impacted, the impact to public safety, you know, if the road has a pump station on it, or is an evacuation road, for example, the damage potential. So one example is Bayview Ave in Higgins Beach neighborhood. So that has a high damage potential. It was damaged in the past. And so it has a high cost for replacement of that road. So that's a higher consequence. The environmental impact and also the economic impact. So how well traveled is this road? What kind of zoning district is it in? So for all of this, we had a whole matrix where for each of these, you could score each road from 5 having a high impact for each of these categories, or 1 having a low impact. And after we did that process, it's combined with the exposure of the roads, or how likely is it to see flooding. We ranked the roads and in terms of priority based on these consequences, which can be revised in the future. There's other consequences that arise. But these were the top 30 roads. This is an alphabetical order, not in order of 1 to 30. We recognize that having a list, there is a list that details 1 to 100, but there may not be, it may not make sense to start at number 1, for example. So we don't want there to be emphasis on needing to follow the order, because there may be grants that are available for certain roads, or it just may not make sense to focus on a different road than number 1. But of these roads, 11 of them are in the Pine Point neighborhood. So the avenues, Driftwood Lane, East Grand Ave, Jones Creek Drive, King Street, Pine Point Road, and Snow Canning Road, which I think of as on the verge of the neighborhood. And so those are the ones that we have identified. And so going back to the story map. There's a section in here on the roads. And where these prioritized roads are all called out. So you can either zoom to the road itself or click to the road from over here, and that will zoom for you so that you can see exactly where that road is. We also included as part of this project some high-level adaptation options for some of the roads in these top 30. For some of them, like the avenues in Pine Point, it doesn't necessarily make sense to do a road elevation or adaptation project for an individual road. when it's really the neighborhood as a whole that you should be looking at. So you will notice if you explore here that some of the roads have adaptation options and some of them say, we're looking at this as a neighborhood. Spots here. Okay. And then as part of this, there is a report. So you can also dive into the nitty-gritty details of that process, and that should be linked to in the story map. For adaptation, this is a slide I showed last time, just framing adaptation generally, and the big picture is you can keep water out, build a wall, build a levee, don't let water come in. You can let the water come in and raise your infrastructure. So the water still does what it wants to do and you accommodate it. You could move out of the way of the water and sell your house, get out of there. You could also look at nature-based solutions. So if you're subject to wave damage, you could look into dune restoration or beach nourishment in order to help break up that wave energy before it can damage to the full potential the property that it's protecting. For this project, we looked at specific but high-level adaptation recommendations for the top 30 roads, pump stations, select town facilities like this fire station, public works, the wastewater treatment plant, or other pretty important assets. And then Higgins and Pine Point neighborhoods as a whole. And we framed these adaptation options in terms of relative cost estimates, in terms of $1 to $4 signs. And the idea behind these dollar signs is not necessarily a dollar amount, but more the level of effort it would take the town to accomplish one of these projects. So $1 sign would be a low cost measure that would likely be feasible within a single fiscal year using existing funds. So that could be, we need to put up road barriers. These roads are flooding. We want to stop people from driving down them. We can do that this year. $2 signs would be a moderate cost measure that likely requires capital improvement planning, but is probably achievable within one budget cycle. So when the budget cycle is happening, we want an engineering study, we need to do more, and there will likely be the funds to do that. $3 signs is where most of these projects fall, which would be a high cost measure that requires funding or a multi-year implementation approach. So a road elevation project, probably you're going to do the design and then the construction, and it may require getting a grant or a few years down the road. And then $4 signs is like, this is an extreme project. It costs a ton of money. This would be 10 years of funding or some miracle grant that the town was able to get. This is all detailed in the report as well as in the story map. And then, so I want to talk about Pine Point adaptation specifically. And the first thing I need to talk about with that is the coastal sand dunes. So this is a map from the Geological Survey, which shows the mapped sand dunes for this neighborhood. Essentially, the entire neighborhood is mapped as a sand dune. So the area that is mostly red is primarily the frontal dune. So that area is much more heavily regulated. That is really just those beach properties and maybe not even all of them. And then everywhere else in the neighborhood is in a back dune. So the most important thing to know about the sand dunes is that no new seawalls are allowed to be built in sand dunes. So the seawall as an option for adaptation is essentially out of the mix for this neighborhood. However, In the back dune, which is most of the neighborhood, you can elevate roads and parking lots, so that option is potentially available. The first thing that we want to focus on is safety. So the number one piece of safety for this neighborhood is evacuation routes. So our number one recommendation is to establish evacuation routes and to prioritize adapting those evacuation routes, specifically Pine Point Road. So that would really be an elevation project of elevating Pine Point Road so that you can still drive on it during these flood events. Alternatively, East Grand Ave, so prioritizing that, although, as you know, you then are driving through Old Orchard Beach, and so there would need to be a coordination with the town of Old Orchard Beach so that that road is accessible during these storm events and into the future. The second recommendation we have is developing a flood alert system. So we will all get those National Weather Service alerts on our phones. So anybody that's in an area, if there's a National Weather Service alert, will get that. They don't need to live here, they could just be visiting, they could be a seasonal renter, but if in that area, you will get it. Because one thing that we've thought about is there might be systems in place for homeowners and this Pine Point Neighborhood Association email network, and I'm not sure the communication lines you have set up to use Facebook groups, but people who are renting for the season or just visiting might not have that same communication network and might miss out on alerts for upcoming storm events. So how do we make sure those people are getting the information they need to stay safe? And then also, if there's a flooding event that occurs in the middle of the night, how do people know that they might be in danger? So one thought is to have sirens or air horns in the neighborhood for kind of like the tornado horns that might be in the Midwest, but for flooding. One adaptation option I want to highlight are temporary flood barriers. So here's an example of a tiger dam. This is something that could be deployed if a storm is coming. So with the sand dune rules, you are allowed to have temporary barriers, and you're allowed to have temporary barriers for up to 7 months of the year. So it could be something that's somewhat semi-permanent for the winter months or when storms are likely to come. It could be something that's just used, like, for example, this is a really good building that is kind of at risk of flooding for part of it, but it's a pretty essential building. So a tiger dam could be used for around the backside where that flooding might come in to still allow this building to be usable. Designate emergency shelters. So I've highlighted this building as a possibility for this neighborhood. So if people can't access their homes, or if it's winter, or if there's flooding and they can't get in and out, to have somewhere in the neighborhood where people can have access to power, for example, and shelter. It doesn't need to be this building, but this is an example. So the next thing is specifically what can be done. These are very high level. How many times can I say this? High level examples of possibilities. So the flood map here is an astronomical high tide in 2050. I have highlighted here roads that theoretically could be elevated given the sand dune rule. However, elevating these roads would be very difficult with right-of-way challenges. So the area you need to actually elevate a road. If you do elevate a road and then you have all these driveways that rely on that road, now it's difficult to then make sure everybody has access to their own home. Also, when you elevate these roads, you create another issue with flooding around rainfall flooding. So now maybe you have these areas that are essentially levied in, that when it rains, could be subject to rainfall flooding, and so drainage infrastructure would need to be in place, maybe some pumping infrastructure. There are many steps to this that would need to be investigated and thought out, so I'm just throwing out a big picture idea, and then there's a lot that needs to come to see if this could even be possible. But let's say theoretically, you were to elevate Jones Creek Drive, Avenue 5, River Sands Drive. You could, there's a situation where those roads are then drivable and the flooding in the avenues from coastal flooding is reduced. Because you've essentially made a levee with Jones Creek Drive. This does not protect any of the homes that are on the marsh side of Jones Creek Drive. This comes with many challenges, like I said, right of way, driveways, and rainfall flooding. So many caveats to this. So this is the main, just to go back, this is the main, the big picture things here are elevating Pine Point Road to have emergency access. And making sure there's good neighborhood alert systems, emergency evacuation, emergency shelters during storms. And then there are some possibilities for road elevation within the neighborhood itself. One part of this project was looking at the four town ordinances and reviewing them to understand if there are places within the ordinances where you could update the language to make the town a little more resilient to flooding. As part of this, we did not come up with exact language, and there has been no actual decisions made on if any of these ordinances will possibly be updated. This was like a very initial step. And this was based on a lot of coastal communities in New England and other policies that other places have taken in order to increase their resilience. So we're looking at examples to say, could that be used here in Scarborough? The last thing I want to say, about adaptation is to consider the idea of long-term managed retreat. So I purposely put a very small picture of the flood risk. This map highlights daily flooding, so not just your astronomical high tide, but your every single day high tide in the year 2100 with 4 feet of sea level rise. So that is 75 years away. There are people alive today who will be alive then. It is not as far away as we think it is. And it's important to keep this topic of discussion on the table because there is a significant area of this neighborhood that if nothing is done, we'll start to see everyday high tide flooding. So the last thing that I want to go over is the pilot project for Pine Point. There were 3 pilot projects as part of this project. One was looking at Payne Road. One is looking at shoreline stabilization measures for Higgins Beach. And then the third one, which we'll talk about, is a homeowner adaptation guide for this neighborhood, which really could be used elsewhere in Scarborough as well. And this, we have a draft document currently, and there are 7 main steps to understanding if and how you could elevate your home. And we are going to walk through this as if this fire station were a house and we owned it and we wanted to know how we could adapt it through elevation. So the very first step of this is to understand what the flood risk is to your property. So we say, go to the story map. There's a few scenarios which we think it's important to look at. The first is scenario 2. So that would be high tide flooding by 2050. Are you gonna start to see that daily or monthly flooding? I have a still image of the story map results there for the fire station. And it is in the clear for that high tide flooding by 2050. Which was not the case for the pump station and Pickens Beach, so we're in a little better situation here. However, scenario 5 is 100-year coastal flooding by 2050. So in 2050, are we starting to get those 1% annual chance storms? It's getting close to this building, especially on that back side of it. And then high tide flooding for 2100. We start to see portions of that building, this building that we are in, starting to see some of that high tide flooding by the year 2100, so 4 feet of sea level rise. So now we understand our general risk, and the idea is, okay, we see this risk. Do we still feel good about living here in this property? And do we want to elevate it to maintain our house? We're gonna say that our answer is yes, we feel pretty good about this risk. Let's move on to see what we need to do. So the second step that I want to talk about is to review the FEMA flood maps. So the flood maps that we've made, the story map flood maps, show many different scenarios, different years, high tide, 100-year storm surge. FEMA's maps show flooding, including wave action, just for today's water levels. They don't include sea level rise or future events. It does look worse. I'm going to bring up our website for this area because it is including wave action and splash over flooding from the ocean. So if you go to the story map, there are links to all of these places so you can explore yourself. This is FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. You can zoom into your property, the fire station, to see what FEMA zone is in. So here I go, zooming in, load, and the building is right here. There are 2 different zones that it's in. So this little white line cuts off the zones. Whatever is the higher zone governs the zone. So if you're in 2 different zones, and the worst one is the one you're in. So the fire station is in an AE zone of elevation 13 and an AE zone of elevation 12. So elevation 13 is the zone that this building is in that we'll need to think about for adaptation. The next step, so we're writing down all of these zones we're in. The next step is to check the coastal sand dune zone map. So the fire station's right here. It is in a back dune zone. The next step is to check the shoreland zoning overlay. You can get to this from the town website. You can also call the town planning code enforcement office and say, is my house in the shoreline zoning overlay? And they will tell you. That overlay, the shoreline zone is 250 feet from a high tide essentially. So if you are near the beach, then likely you will be in, or even the marsh side, you might be in that zone. This building is not in that zone. So then we have this detailed table where in the left column, you find your zone combination. So were you in a FEMA B zone and the frontal dune? Were you in a FEMA A zone and the frontal dune? This building was in a FEMA A zone and a back dune. So that's what I've highlighted. And then over in the right column, you're told what that means you need to do for elevation. So you want to elevate your house, you decided to live here. Okay, that zone combination means that you need to elevate your house on open pilings to at least 2 feet above that FEMA elevation, base flood elevation. So the base flood elevation was 13 feet. So this building would need to be elevated to 15 feet. That's about 3.5 feet higher than the ground surface where it is right now. So, you can imagine 3.5 foot pilings and a small staircase to get into our house. In some cases, it might need to be 8 feet, 10 feet. That's a little bit different than having a small staircase. But this is the process you could go through to understand what that might look like. Contact code enforcement. You can do this at any point in the process, but our thought is, once you have like a general sense, contact code enforcement and say, do I understand this right? These are the zones I believe I'm in. I want to elevate my house. Looks like I have to go pilings. Walk me through what that means. And after you have seen all of this and say, okay, I'm in, I want to stay here, I want to elevate my house, you then need to hire a contractor. Here's an example of a house in Scarborough, Higgins Beach, elevated on open pilings. So that's what that means to be open pilings. You can really, see through that bottom level of the house. If you're in a shoreland zone, which this house is not in this house, you do need to have a contractor that's certified in erosion and sediment control practices. DEP maintains a list of those contractors, so it's kind of a really good place to start. If you're not in a shoreline zone, you don't need that requirement. So you can talk to your neighbors who have elevated their home to see, which contractors they use, to know where you can start on that step. That's our last step for figuring out how you could elevate your home if you choose to stay, and you're committed. And then this is our last slide. So I just want to wrap up by saying that this project is almost over. And by next month, there will be a final story map with our final work products and also an executive summary. So we've created maybe 7 different demo report documents as part of this project that will kind of compile all that information into one more easy to read document that you could read, or you could read through the story map. And that's it. So I also just want to point out that I'm joined here tonight by my colleague Lisa Vickers, and she is a permitting specialist. So, questions that are like really specific to what you can do, she's a good resource, and why we are both here tonight. So I will now turn it over to you all for questions.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Wonderful. Wonderful presentation.
Don't like what you have to say, but it's kind of like you're doing it.
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll start here.
Time?
Yeah.
Does your study take into account the environmental ignorance of the current administration?
So questions have come up in the past, a lot of our projects on around funding. And are federal grants going to be available for this type of work, and how will that impact these adaptation projects? And I just want to say, first of all, that the state of Maine has done quite a bit of work and is very progressive in terms of sea level rise and these grant availabilities and resources for the municipalities of the state of Maine. So I feel very lucky to work in this state that's supported by the state of Maine. We have seen some impacts to federal grants. I don't know all of the answers. I don't think that is going to last forever. This came up in the Higgins Beach neighborhood meeting of a lot of these projects. Once you get to construction is really when you need those federal grants that are multi-millions of dollars. But before that, there's a lot of steps in design and permitting and modeling studies. And that's something that can be done over the next few years with existing funds from the town and also grants that are available from the state of Maine. So there's still a lot of work to be done before we're really at that federal grant point.
That didn't really answer my question.
We are really just looking at the science right now, and
Okay.
so, and what is dictated through, a lot of the state policy in terms of what we are allowed to do.
Yeah.
It didn't take into account really any of the actions of the current administration. I just want to also say before we go on, folks on Zoom, if you have a question, we can see if you raise your hand, so if you do have questions on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get to you as well.
I have a question about current homeowners could do, not in terms of depth of your house, but to minimize the damage or the risk now. For instance, we had that flooding in 2024, propane tanks flooded, floated away. Are there places we can go to give tips to the homeowners to protect your house now, to minimize public safety risk to ourselves and our neighbors?
Yeah, so we did create an adaptation report document. As part of this, which is either in the story map already or will be very soon, which has some public resources, mostly from FEMA, about homeowner guides. So things like tying down tanks, sandbag use, for example, some kind of, storm is coming, what can I do right now? And then what can I think about over the next year without doing a major home elevation project? So we have tried to include that information.
Can you speak more to those temporary flood barriers? You had a picture, like orange.
The Tiger Dam, yeah. So there's a few different, that's not the only temporary flood barrier, that was just one example. These are used a lot in this, I've seen a lot of examples of this use case in the South and Florida and Texas and places that, see more significant hurricane flooding where the water really just sits for like a day, 2 days. Where hospitals or important buildings have these dams built around them, so the building can still be in use, but it could also be used along the shoreline, for example.
Would that have helped in that last storm we had where?
Potentially, yes.
If we had had that, would have protected dunes, wouldn't it?
I haven't seen it used directly on dunes, but I'm sure that there are examples we could look for. Yeah, there are some concerns, if it is there right on the dune and waves come, it could cause
The
some
barrier's not good.
erosion, local erosion. So that's, would need to be considered. Yes.
I may sound like a wet blanket on all of this, but we need to realize that this is not a temporary happening. This is something that's been going on for 700,000 years, is the ice cycle and the warming cycle. We are now only in the beginning of the warming cycle. There are artifacts up in Gorham, Maine of sand and seashells. So when the water's gonna rise, it's gonna rise. We can't do anything about that. So we need to take all the measures you can, but these are like little bandages you're talking about. You need to take a look at this 7 miles of beach, and there should be all the communities involved, Ferry Beach or Orchard, all of them. Because what's unique about this beach, and I'm gonna tell you, my grandfather, I was over at Post Neck as a baby. My grandfather walked out to an island with the cows 120 years ago, so they could graze in the summertime. People would have a very difficult time even thinking to swim out there now. I could walk off the beach at Post Neck and be on the sand. Today, if I walk the same place, I drop down 10 and more feet. That's how much erosion and sand has been removed. And it's because you need to consider the entire ocean, which is the land underneath, which is called the sublittoral zone, the beach, which you are all occupying, which is the littoral zone where we tan and everything, and the supralittoral zone, which is the marsh. And we've built on the marsh, we've built on the dunes. So we're in the dunes ourselves. But the thing we need to consider is that this is going to continue and nature's going to have its way. But what is unique about this beach? And that's what should be addressed by all the communities and written for a grant to continue. If you want to stay here longer, what's unique about this? Trout's Neck is eroded more than 10 feet. I spent years at Wells Beach, which is eroded 15 and more feet. High tide every day comes in and hits the places all the time. It doesn't do that here yet. Because you have a land bridge that goes from Trout's Neck over to Camp Ellis. And you know there's an island sitting out there. But if you go to Joseph's Restaurant, you'll see that over 100 years ago, that was a land bridge. So what happens is that rough ocean out there, the energy of those waves has scraped away Trout's Neck, Higgins. Higgins doesn't have a chance. What other beach around here is like that? Goose Rocks, and you take a look at Goose Rocks Beach, and there's an island out there, another land bridge. So what happens is those land bridges absorb the energy of the waves. And it takes up their energy, and then we get the new wave that's coming in, doesn't have as much energy. But as the water is rising, the energy of those waves gets bigger and more energetic. So it's going to start to erode more and more of our beach. So what do we need to do? The solution, I will say, and I'll be dead before they'll do it, is you need to build up that land bridge out there. And it takes all of the communities and all of the monies and a big grant from the government to do that. That's what's been protecting this area all these years. And you know that if you go and take a look at what I'm talking about. So if they could all together. So the patch up things are fine. You certainly should do Pine Point Road. So we can all get out of here, but to a little elevated, but I mean, these are just small solutions. The big solution is to get that land bridge built up so it absorbs the energy of big waves out there. And we continue to have the smaller, easy ones. This beach is a gem, it's unique. But look at Trout's Neck and right next door, Camp Ellis. Camp Ellis has lost 2 roads and anything that sticks out, benefit pool, but go look at Goose Rocks again. You see, it's got the same idea that we have here. They've got that in that island. So when you plan and make decisions, you really should do big time because this is 10,000 years into the warming trend. And they go for 50 to 100,000 years. Nature's done this 7 times now in the last 700,000 years. We have the warming trend and we have the freezing trend. And they come and go and they go in different cycles. Some are longer than others and some are shorter than others. But they're normally an average of 50,000 years and we're only into 10,000. So we can be here for a time, but we have to be realistic and know that that guy out there is going to have its way.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very.
Hi, my name is Jim Long, in 1994, and I've been here most every summer. Because on the grass school, the people completely sad. And I actually love Pine Point, as I look at what's going on. The issue is wide of water, and we have a challenge, the climate change. And we plus the gases and accelerating what's going on right now. United comes with oil industry, choosing oil, then they directly work with the to produce our oil and the ways to do things. And yeah, it's just so much easier now with some of the technology. Now, the other thing is that we get to reduce our failures dramatically and have more heat pumps when they don't work. And then we get to look at what goes on with plastic in the ocean. And I've been picking up plastic along with throughout a long time and walking along the beaches or walking along the roads here. We have to do that. But we got to reduce plastic because plastic is desperately bad for the fishing industry, especially bad for the ocean. And all of it right now have plastic in our brains. That's a problem. And other kinds of body, we tend to avoid it. The way plastic, when plastic is created before it. And the creation of plastic is firstly devastating, heating and all those things. I think it's, going back, getting it, then the bottom line. If the reader should. Yeah. I'll be right over. And every time we build oil, we give our peanut, gases, make the oil good, just make any plastic to those peanut gases. And then it just destroys the ocean. And I was talking to a young woman at the Pine Point conference. Wishing say something. And she was thinking, she's out there the last all the times. Nice days. She says that, plastic pollution, we're supposed to be able to. The director was asked to act, and that's the global warming, there's more plastic pollution. Fishing industry. All of it. So thank you very much. And any questions? Another question for you. Oh, and the county administration has cut off all clean energy. Has cut off all clean energy, has, there are 5 wind towers, wind energy for things across the developed here in Maine. They've been disallowed. So we've got a real problem. We've got to change. We're back to Wallace.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, when you're doing the projects that raise the roads that could cause, the town, when you're doing these projects that could cause harm to the properties that, it'll affect. Is it typical that there are grants that are going towards that would also help the homeowners that are gonna be affected worse? It's going to affect the neighborhood in the other direction, those people will make it better, but the ones on the, will take the brunt. Do you know how that usually works, or are they just expected to go running on their library hours for those projects?
Yeah, so first I wanna say that there are no plans in the works to actually do these projects of elevating roads in the Pine Point neighborhood. There are, I will say, projects in the works in the town of Scarborough for elevating some roads, so Route 1 through the Marsh and Pine Point Road farther north near the Audubon. But not this section right here. So before I say that nothing's being done, there is stuff being done. But in this neighborhood, there are no actual plans yet to do anything, and there would need to be many studies done and neighborhood communication, a landowner work to even begin thinking about that process. If there is a project that is done that has an impact on a neighboring property, then it is part of the responsibility of the town to minimize, reduce that impact. And so that would be part of any possible future.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Virginia was talking about getting together all the communities, that really are affected by this beach. And I'm wondering if you reached out at all to Old Orchard Beach and Bedford Pool and any of those other communities to see if they would want to come in with you in studying and coming up with remedial work that can be done?
So, not yet through this process. It is a recommendation of this process to begin working with our neighboring communities to address regional opportunities. We'll say that there is a group that is focused on Saco Bay, and Scarborough is a member of that. They're very focused on the Camp Ellis issue and the jetty and the issues plaguing that area or that portion of Saco Bay. But I could see potentially expanding the scope and looking kind of larger scale to explore some of the ideas that were shared this evening.
There are people from all the communities on that group?
Yeah,
All right.
yes, there are.
Okay, thank you.
We had some online with the Cambridge, but they it down, so I decided to just make a flag for anyone online that wants to ask a question.
We'll go over here and then we can go online.
You had mentioned sand dune that was lost in storm in 24. Is there a sand dune that was lost that was at some increased vulnerability? Is there a plan to replenish that?
Yeah, so the town is currently working, through a FEMA process to look into getting some emergency funding for the town-owned portions of Pine Beach, so near Bird Park and Oak Street. The other portions of Pine Point Beach, and I'm not going to even talk about the area of conservation easement, but the rest of the beach, those are all, those dunes are part of that particular homeowner that lives there. So any homeowner who has a dune can go through a dune restoration process. Although I will say, and I don't necessarily want to speak for the town, but I think that there is a thought of in the future, you know, seeing where this FEMA process goes that they're currently in the middle of, and then if there's a possibility for doing a beach-wide dune restoration.
Kind of hoping it would come up with, some sort of templates that if we can get through the process, people are reimbursement, it'd be something that maybe we could try to figure out how it translates to private properties. It's a little easier for FEMA, well, it's the only way for FEMA is for the public infrastructure. So, but trying to find that correlation that there's things we can learn from that private homeowners utilize their views.
So I'm just a little confused about that ownership of the beach piece. Because it's my understanding that they own to the high tide mark. Is that not the case?
They own a low tide, actually.
Oh, to low tide.
Low tide.
It could be.
You mean
there are-
from their house all the way?
Yes.
Yes.
But individual deeds should be reviewed because they're transfer of ownership over the years, in some cases with surveying. Oftentimes what we see is that, you know, they'll put pins at the high tide line, so the deed may reference that. But it was because in some cases, not necessarily related to Pine Point, but if you have a mud flat in front of your property. Well, yes, Maine is a low water state, so technically everyone, if you own waterfront, may own to mean low water. There has been, you know, over the years, maybe someone set that aside, that intertidal area for clamming. And only conveyed the high tide upland area back.
Ah,
So it's
Okay.
really, I mean, in general, we are a low tide state, but, you know, each individual deed should be reviewed, because it could vary.
oh, well, that's interesting.
So a few years ago, when we did an emergency dredge, all the dredge, there was no place pre-approved. Apparently it takes years to figure out where is the sand gonna go. So it all just went out to Little River Rock and was dumped. And then the most recent dredge, my understanding was that the spoils from the dredge went to the Prouts Neck golf area. So could the town, in advance of the next dredge, start the process of making sure that there's a place in Pine Point that is gonna be ready, and we've got all the approvals, everything's all lined up, so that when the dredge actually happens, whether it's an emergency dredge or a planned dredge, the spoils will come to Pine Point.
Yeah. that-
Yes.
And is that in the work? Is anyone?
It's not currently, but yeah, it is on our radar that Pine Point, that we need a plan for Pine Point so that you could be the benefit of the dredge spoils.
And I understand that, I mean, we could be looking at another emergency dredge because of the condition of the river at this point. So we're just gonna wait around until
Obviously, the emergency dredge is a little more, like, obviously a condensed timeline, so it's a little more difficult, but I know we have had conversations with, the emergency management, folks for Maine and working through FEMA and then the local entity. So those conversations have already started to look ahead at sort of like the next scheduled dredge to try to see if we can kind of move that, to your point, and leave it here at one point. I do have a couple of
Yeah.
comments that they didn't want us to be, but there's a couple writing here, so I will start. Thank you for the presentation regarding the.
You have to speak up.
I'm sorry.
The louder.
Regarding the 2050 and 2100 high tide mapping, do I understand it correctly that those are everyday high tides as opposed to a storm tides that will, as opposed to can, represent the daily high tide water lines?
So thank you for that question. So we looked at 10 different water levels that represent different scenarios. The maps that were shown during this presentation for 2050 and 2100 were that highest astronomical tide, which wouldn't be daily flooding. It would be maybe once or twice a year during that astronomically high tide. And then I also, just my, engineering risk averse self, I cannot say that those will be reached. So looking at our estimate for what sea level rise will likely be of 1.5 feet or 4 feet, those are elevations that may happen if that were to be realized. And highest astronomical tide, for example, right now is 6.5 feet. That's a very exact number. In reality, the water elevation of the ocean isn't exact. It's going to go up a few inches or down a few inches. So it's difficult in this line of work to say something will occur. This is all our best guess, knowing what we know.
But like for 1 foot of height, it inundates over 100 feet. So that's what people, when we say the sea level's rising, and that's why you're getting all the flooding, is they don't understand that for every time it rises 1 foot, it inundates over 100 or more feet.
Yeah, in flat areas like the backside of this neighborhood where it's pretty flat and low lying, that's where you are seeing that pretty significant flood inundation.
So the next one is regarding the Pine Point homeowners adaptation guide. I am happy to learn the details, but it appears to me that in our area, most of the protective responsibility is placed on the homeowners versus Higgins, where the town is piloting intervention. I believe we also need intervention and financial assistance that is not selling out our properties. So I guess I can jump in per se, the demonstration projects we talked about at Higgins is, well, first off, zooming back out a little bit, this study was first looked at as public infrastructure, is where's the town's available infrastructure, we look at what the town can do. At Higgins Beach, that demonstration project was really, we're talking about Bayview and the protection of sewer and protection of water, protection of some of the pump stations, and really that kind of public infrastructure that affects many homes and residents. And so that might be some of the differences here. As we said, we are looking at the dunes on Pine Point and trying to do kind of what is our next step in looking ahead, where this study kind of limited us with here's where we're at, but doesn't mean that there aren't recommendations to move on to the next step and actually look for funding to move that other piece forward and looking at how we protect those dunes. Because Pine Point is unique. It does have that dune system that has protected it for many years, and that other communities do not have. I think you're fortunate that you have that dune system, and we really need to protect that and encourage the protection of that.
And I just want to clarify also the pilot project at Higgins Beach are concept plans. So the town doesn't have active plans to move forward and implement them yet. Really, the goal there was to get some better, more concrete, guidance from the main DEP about what we could potentially do there. It's been that the section of Bayview Avenue that Angela mentioned has been, a chronic challenge. There's a revetment on one side and seawalls on the other, and a very small strip of dune in the middle. And that small strip of dune is very vulnerable, because of the hard surfaces on either side. It's very prone to erosion. So, in the past, DEP has said, that their preferred approach would be dune restoration in that area. And so we essentially provided, some options for them to consider, so that we have an idea moving forward, if we are going to do a project at Higgins Beach at that location, what DEP would permit. Because a lot of this stems because we are working in a sand dune. What do the state regulations allow us to do? And so getting some more, some better, more concrete feedback from DEP was the goal of that. So not to say that we're moving that project forward more quickly than a different project perhaps down here at Pine Point, but we were hoping to get some better guidance from the state regulators, so that we have an idea of what we should be planning for that site.
You know, I think just for clarity, that some people don't understand about beach walls. And they think that's the first thing they wanna do is build a wall to prevent all this. What people don't understand is waves. Waves have a crest and a trough, and they make a circle. They do this. And the deeper the water, the more energy that wave gains, okay? So that's what I've said about out there, the big waves out there hit the wall, and okay, so now we're talking about what we need to do here to protect things. And it's we need to be able to break those waves before they come. So if Higgins wants to do anything, they need to put a barrier parallel to the shore, like that land bridge is. And what the waves do with the wall is because they break, they can't expand their energy. The revetment is a good thing, because we used to have a beach, if you remember, your beaches used to pitch more. And you'd come down, okay, so that's the waves can go up there and expand their energy and get rid of it. But now, because they're breaking so close to shore, and I know because of Wells Beach, what they do is they, you know, we talk about breakers, everybody thinks the waves are the breakers. The breaker is when the wave breaks. So when the wave goes and hits the bottom, it spills over. That's the breaker. And that's only the time where the energy is going to be taken care of. So what's going to be taken care of is if it breaks up against a wall, it can't get rid of its energy. So what does it do? It takes all the sand away. It pulls all that sand away from the wall. So no more walls. And I knew that over 30 years ago because I walked Prout's Neck with a scientist from the University of Maine who pointed that out to everyone. And so it's so easy. There's so much little things that people don't understand. And if they did, I think they would do things better and address the situations better than they do.
I defer to the historic perspective on, does it help us or hurt us to have enough sand running Prout's Neck that we could fill every sandbox in America? And that's the, I understand the end result of the train of sand that starts from Camp Ellis and ends at the Scarborough River.
Okay, I want to say that, right? What that is a land bridge. It's not a sand. It's rock. It's granite. And I say you go to Joseph's Restaurant, have a nice dinner, and you'll see as you walk in, there's a picture over 100 years old, and you'll see much more of that land bridge. We only see the islands, I think, wow. There's much more exposure 100 years ago. So what I've suggested, and I'm not, I have no right to suggest, but I do have a degree in, I study oceanography, and I have a doctorate in marine science. But what I'm saying is, what we need to do is get a big grant, because that's what it's gonna take. Because this is 7 miles of premier beach.
Yeah.
You go down the East Coast, you won't find a beach like this. And I say go, the one place right now, Goose Rocks can identify with it because of the same thing. What they need to do is get big granite, and we're a state of granite, and New Hampshire's a state of granite. And they need to build what nature already did, and it's told us what to do. Build up that land bridge. And the more you build up that land bridge to be as high as the island, you have to do it over time and a lot of money. That'll keep those waves away from this beach. And you're talking about erosion of your homes and everything else. What erodes it and is causing the problem is that wave energy out there. So if you can control it for so many years, you've got to be, you've got to be realistic.
That was the
This is gonna
concept of
happen.
Camp Ellis. To save Camp Ellis, the idea was 3 adjoining sort of small jetties that were gonna stop the wave action.
They're this way. They
Yeah,
need
they're going
to
the
be
wrong
parallel.
direction.
Yeah, I don't know.
It needs to be parallel to break those waves when they're coming in.
Yeah, anyhow, I know it's getting more.
So I also just wanna make the point that this study was looking largely at sea level rise and storm surge and not necessarily at waves. So we understand that waves are a challenge as well, but the fact of the matter is the water is still rising. So, all of these, suggestions about addressing wave energy certainly will help maintain healthy beaches, healthy dune systems. But we're still going to have flooding from the marsh side, even when all of that, if that work is done.
So
Just a quick question. On the matter of this, use of the dredging, should the Pine Point Association do something to push, making sure that we are prepared and we do have a spot that's been approved?
I think, right now, that's what we're trying to figure out with our permitting and trying to figure out what we need. But I think what you guys can do, and we said this at Higgins, is the more you reach out to your elected officials, and I'm talking state, federal, kind of elected officials, as we said, is really gonna need like bigger monies coming down. And keeping that kind of squeaky wheel, I think is really kind of where I think it would be beneficial.
But where would the decision on where you put the dredging, where you put the residual
that's-
from the dredging? Is that the state or is it that, or
Typically, the Army Corps of Engineers.
the Army Corps of Engineers? Okay. Mhm.
There's,
Oh,
I will say there is coordination in the state through the Maine Coastal Program. There's a woman that runs. She coordinates efforts with Army Corps and state, agencies, and they have quarterly meetings to talk about upcoming dredge projects throughout the state. So I mean, it's a resource, Erin Wilson is her name with the Maine Coastal Program, just as, she's not, these meetings are not like open to public forums. It's more about the coordination, because Army Corps really is making a push for beneficial reuse of dredge sediments, and it's a little different with sand. That's always kind of been the case. But even in areas where you have more like silt and mud, using those sediments maybe in marsh restoration projects and getting those efforts coordinated. So it's just a resource that you could look into as well through the Maine Coastal Program.
Her name is?
Erin Wilson. Yeah.
So this might be another question for you, Lisa. Online, someone asked, with an environmental beachfront easement, which I assume they're referring to the conservation easement, I'm very sure, what options are there?
Well, you have to look at the language, the specific language of that, even from a permitting perspective, it comes down to the title right or interest, and if there's, specific language within the easement that, is restrictive of any type of structure or alteration, and, that could be interpreted differently, maybe minimal options.
Yeah, I think that's what we're finding there.
First, thank you for presenting this. This is really, really good information. We put a lot of thought and work into this, so really appreciate it. So if I'm interpreting, the big threat is gonna be the marsh side, right? If we look at the immediate threat. From what I understood as well, is most of these projects are the $3 sign to the $4 sign amount, right? Which are gonna take some time and funding. When we leave this meeting, what are the next steps to get towards those $3 signs, if that's what we need to do to fix or mitigate some of the issue?
some of it, as Leela had said, is going to be, identifying what our priorities are, what our current needs are, so looking at where we have road work maybe planned and thinking about how can we, address those road projects with the vulnerability assessment in mind and plan for what's needed. Some of it is going to be, either the town allocating funds or going after grants for the modeling and engineering studies. And hoping that within the next 4 or 5 years, the landscape for larger federal grants changes so that we can begin. We'll be ready when that does change so that we can apply for those larger grants and begin addressing the $3 and $4 sign projects.
Thank you.
How do we access this information again?
So the slideshow, will be available on the town's website. If you just go to scarboroughmaine.org and search vulnerability assessment, should be there, by the end of this week or early next week. The recording, of this meeting is available, right now on the town's YouTube channel. We're live streaming it. And then also from the vulnerability assessment page, there is a link there to the interactive story map that Leela was showing you this evening. So you can click there, go to the story map, zoom around town and see how the different scenarios, flooding scenarios may impact your area and other areas of the town in the future.
I just wanted to follow up on something too, when we're talking about, the last comments, where I did have someone online that said, that as a director of the PPA, I did inquire about the option of the emergency dredging by the Army Corps of Engineers, and I was told it is completely up to the Corps. More action and pressure can be applied.
If that's true, they did dredge at Wells and they decided to take it way out, way back, way back, nowhere near the beach. They took the
But
sand
as
and all
Lisa
that.
said, I think it's more of, it's
The
optimistic too.
people
with
were
the
very
coordination.
upset, but
Yeah.
as you said, that was their decision.
Yeah, ultimately, yes, but hopefully there's coordination happening, sounds like on the state level.
I just have a question about the ordinances. You listed, I think, 4 maybe? What? I mean, it seems like that's local government. Is that something we can impact somehow? Are you creating some kind of recommendations for ordinance changes?
Yeah. So we highlighted paragraphs in the ordinances where we said this paragraph could be revised in some way to include, for example, sea level rise or the projected high tide by 2050 to change some of the language so that it could be more resilient here. We didn't specify exact language, and in some cases, we brought up other tools that could be used. City of Portland recently redid all of their zoning, and as part of that, they have a coastal overlay zone. And that coastal overlay zone, if you're in that zone, you're subject to some higher design standards. So instead of just the FEMA elevation plus 2 feet, it would be the FEMA elevation, for example, I don't know the exact thing, but plus sea level rise, plus another 2 feet. So a little more strict. We're not saying do that exact thing. We're just saying, here's something you could look into. And one of the things was around transfer of development rights. That idea there is if you have a coastal property or property that may be at risk to flooding, this transfer of development rights could be used as a way to compensate that homeowner or that landowner for their development potential, but instead of them using it to develop on that piece of land that might be in an area that will see flooding every day in 50 years, a developer or somebody else could buy their rights for developing there and develop in an area where Scarborough would rather people develop, so not in a coastal zone, for example. So it's a way to compensate you for your land value and then also, you know, limit the development in these areas. These are all just tools and ideas, and as part of this, you know, if the town looks at these and say, oh, these are interesting ideas, let's move this forward, there will be a full public process where you can have input there.
Yes.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
Your comment, thank you, Bobby, a very good job, much appreciated. But, you know, well, we actually solved all of them, you know. We got realize the reading things at Walmart, things that go over there, I mean, we look at that, we work the project. Now, we actually solve all of that. We can possibly lead other communities, play with names, do some of that, and make sure that they do try to mission. Right now, they're tremendous growth to artificial intelligence. And the people who created this time, you know, that's, you know, there's so much electricity, so much energy. And then if we find a way to make that, okay, you want it, you build it, you pay for it, you make it very pretty. If we do things like that, and I think as a social community, we can all work with us on things. And address it. Go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank